The clues gathered at a homicide challenge investigators' preconceptions. The evidence now compels them to search for the killer in the last place they'd think to look. An unidentified body is abandoned on a Texas freeway. Investigators have miles to go before they gather enough clues to nail her killer. A young woman disappears. Detectives must weave a missing persons case around a tattered shirt and a shard of plastic. Big crimes are often solved by the smallest clues. Every criminal takes something away from the crime scene and leaves something behind. Forensics is the science of building a case by reading each remnant of blame. Northeast of Atlanta sits the city of Sugar Hill, Georgia. It's a little city of about 5,000 people, but it found itself in the midst of a big city problem. On the morning of April 16, 1993, a garage owner found a car abandoned in his parking lot. When he looked inside, he discovered a terrible crime. The body of a woman was slumped in the driver's seat, dead. Officers of the Gwinnett County Police Department responded to the scene. From the position of her body and the direction of the blood spatter, it was clear the woman had been shot in the head. Her purse was not in the car. Police could find no identification, nor did they have a suspect. But the evidence did point to a motive. Assistant Police Chief John Latty believed this was a carjacking gone wrong.
The ignition was on, but the engine was off, gas in the tank. She had power windows, and her window was rolled down, but she was seat belted in the car.
In a random crime like carjacking, the perpetrator leaves few clues. Police didn't even know where to begin. All that changed with the arrival of a man named Michael Thompson. Driving by the scene, he noticed the commotion. Then he saw the car. It looked like his mother's. To Latty, Thompson's arrival was too much of a coincidence.
We were interested in him due to the fact that he showed up at the scene about the time we did. Also, he had a shady past. He had a criminal history, was a suspected drug user, and so therefore the preliminary suspicion fell on him.
Michael Thompson confirmed what the vehicle registration had indicated. The victim was his mother, Emma Jean Thompson, age 53. When police checked into Thompson's background, they learned that his mother had called police in early April to report a burglary. Gwinnett County police officer Michael Chappell responded to that call. He was told that $7 of the $15,000 the victim kept taped to the back of her dresser had been stolen. Michael Thompson didn't know it, but Emma Jean had told Chappell she thought her son might have stolen the money. She was banking on Officer Chappell to catch the burglar and, if possible, find her money.
She actually showed him, upon his request, the remainder of the money, which was we estimate to be in the neighborhood of $7,000. And all the money was in new $100 bills.
Officer Chappell assured the victim that the money would be easy to find because it was in consecutively numbered, brand new bills. After the murder of Emma Jean Thompson, police discovered that the rest of the cash was missing from its unusual hiding place. They believed Thompson might have killed his mother for the money. They would just have to prove it. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been shot twice in the head at close range with a large caliber weapon. Someone in the area must have heard the shots. Police set up roadblocks to question drivers about what they remembered from the night before. They found an unusual number of potential witnesses. Emma Jean Thompson had been murdered on April 15th. Traffic driving past the murder scene on the way to the nearby post office had been heavy.
Many of them remembered it because it was tax day, and they said, we observed a vehicle sitting behind the victim's vehicle. All of them said it appeared to be a police vehicle. That not only was it a patrol car, but it was one of Gwinnett County police patrol cars, and that it was a specific type and design of a police car, so we were able to determine that it was one of ours.
Witnesses pinpointed the police car at the murder scene between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. Many said it looked as if the victim's car had been pulled over. This disturbing revelation steered suspicion away from the victim's son. As more witnesses came forward, police had to consider the awful possibility that the killer was one of their own. The investigation began within the department. Detectives were aware that Officer Michael Chappell had responded to the victim's burglary complaint 2 weeks earlier. When Chief Latty looked for Chappell's report on the case, he couldn't find it. Chappell was asked about it.
This is okay. If you go ahead and file it.
His reason for not filing a report on the burglary seemed credible.
Of course, he had explanations that he thought it was a BS case and that he didn't want to bother with writing a report. So I instructed him to gather all the information from that time and to write a report.
While Chappell prepared the belated report, detectives interviewed the victim's
How
friends.
you doing? I'm Detective Smith.
They said Emma Jean Thompson had been touched by Officer Chappell's personal interest in her burglary case.
During the course of having these conversations with her friends, she also told her friends that Officer Chappell was concerned about her and was keeping an eye on her, and that she had observed him following her on several occasions. She believed that he was concerned about her and was looking out for her.
To detectives, it was beginning to look as though this guardian angel may have had only his own interests at heart. But they had no evidence to support this theory. Chappell had an alibi for the time of the murder. He said he went to the firehouse to watch TV between 8 and 10:30 p.m. Interviews at the firehouse, however, did not allay suspicion. His friends agreed Chappell was present on the night of the 15th, but no one could agree about when he left. Chappell's alibi was shaky. He still might have had the opportunity to commit the crime. A background check revealed a possible motive. Before the murder, Chappell had been heavily in debt. After the murder, his creditors told police he paid off what he owed with crisp $100 bills. But this would never be enough to convict one of Gwinnett County's finest. Detectives needed more proof before they could make an arrest. They had to be absolutely certain. Investigators soon learned the victim may have met her death by appointment.
We did an interview with one of the victim's close friends who told us that she had had a conversation with the victim, and the victim had reported that she was to meet with Officer Chappell that night, and that he'd instructed her to bring her money because he'd recovered some of her money and could compare serial numbers and hopefully recover some for her. I don't envy them that task.
1 week after the crime, Officer Chappell was called in for a second round of questioning.
If I'd ever had the slightest thought that I'd be sitting here tonight talking to you about a murder, I'd have stayed out there.
Chief Latty talked with Chappell in the police station for hours, hoping he could give them some information that would point the blame elsewhere. He could not.
There are no other suspects at this point.
It was during the course of the interview, probably about 2 hours into the interview, that Investigator Burnett came into the room and informed him that he was being charged with this crime.
Chappell became an enemy of the law he had sworn to uphold.
He reacted by slumping, sighing, and began to talk about the fact that he knew there was no bond for a murder charge, an armed robbery charge, and he'd probably be in jail for a long time before he could prove his innocence.
That is overwhelming evidence. All I've got is what I know happened, and that's not going to do me any good. I have no alibi. I have nothing.
Nothing would make Latty happier than if Chappell could prove he was innocent. But friendship must take a back seat to justice. The chief knew what he had to do. Chappell was relieved of duty and told to turn in his gun and his badge. It was important to treat this case like any other. Only the evidence could prove whether or not Chappell pulled the trigger. Did Officer Michael Chappell kill Emma Jean Thompson in cold blood? To find out, search warrants were executed for his locker and the trunk of his patrol car. Chappell's belongings were entered as evidence and examined closely. His raincoat was sent to the lab and tested for any kind of trace evidence. Tests for minuscule amounts of blood were positive. The stains were shaped like high-velocity blood spatter. When a bullet strikes a body, the impact creates a fine mist of fluids that often blows back toward the weapon and the shooter. While the blood was being analyzed, detectives received another lead from a sharp-eyed car wash manager.
Officer Chappell had been into the car wash on the day that we had discovered the victim's body, and that he'd had his car detailed, his patrol car. Also that he had paid her with a new $100 bill for the work on the car.
His patrol car was brought to the crime lab and examined for potential evidence the detailers might have missed. An adhesive strip was used to lift any hair or fibers left by the victim. One stain on the upholstery warranted closer inspection. Jennifer Archer of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Serology and DNA Unit was given a head start on her work.
When I received the call from Gwinnett County Police Department, they indicated to me that they had performed a field test called luminol. This test showed them that there was a possibility that there was a blood stain on the armrest of the car seat of the patrol car.
Archer tested a swatch from the armrest to see if the stain was truly blood. She dabbed the cloth with 2 moistened cotton swabs. Each swab was then treated with a different chemical. Both swabs changed color, confirming the presence of blood. Was the blood human? Scientists had a test for that, too. A drop of the unknown blood was added to a sample of human antiserum, an enzyme that reacts with proteins found only in human blood. Gravity pulls the blood through the antiserum. If the blood is human, a white line appears. The blood in the police car and on the raincoat was human. Only the results of a DNA comparison could definitely link the bloodstains to the victim, Emma Jean Thompson. The blood was placed in a gel medium and subjected to an RFLP test. In this process, mild electrical current separates the longer and shorter fragments of DNA into a banding pattern unique to the donor. Upon inspection, the patterns in the victim's DNA resembled the sample taken from the cruiser's armrest. Computer analysis statistically confirmed the match. No more than 1 in 10 billion people would share these patterns. Detectives had forged an unbroken chain of evidence between Chappell's coat, his vehicle, and the blood of Emma Jean Thompson. The lab confirmed the grim reality. One of Gwinnett County's cops was a killer. With the forensic evidence in place, events leading up to the murder became clear. On April 15th, Chappell arranged to meet his victim to rob her of the money the burglar had left behind. When the victim opened her purse, Chappell opened fire. Most of the incriminating blood evidence on the coat and in the patrol car was barely visible to the naked eye. But forensic science brought the remnants of the crime into sharp relief in court.
The one key piece of evidence was the DNA evidence. There's no question about that. It's such powerful evidence. And the fact that there was probably some very serious doubt in the minds of a lot of people that Officer Chappell could have or would have committed this crime. And so it took some kind of profound or solid physical evidence to link him to the victim's blood.
As always, the ultimate test of the forensic evidence took place in the jury box. After 18 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Michael Chappell. But he received more mercy than he had shown his victim. He was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years in prison, the stiffest penalty allowed by Georgia law, short of a death sentence. Chappell disguised his crime to look like a failed carjacking. Other killers try to hide their crimes by disposing of the body. The roads leading to Houston are kept as beautiful as the city itself. But on March 27, 1992, a litter crew on a freeway outside of town made an ugly discovery.
You got a TV? Anybody need a TV? Go ahead. Hey, let's see it.
The cardboard box seemed ordinary at first.
Let's do it.
But when they pulled back the flaps, they found themselves staring into a makeshift coffin. Within lay the dismembered remains of a human being. The Houston Police Department's Homicide Division dispatched a forensics unit to the scene. Technicians scoured the roadside for evidence. The victim had been dead several hours. Dismembering the body would have spilled up to 12 pints of blood. But not a drop of blood or any other clue was discovered in the vicinity. Sergeant Mike Peters believed most of the forensic evidence lay elsewhere.
Well, the conclusion that we came to is that this wasn't the actual crime scene. This is just a place where the victim had been placed by the suspect after the crime occurred.
Police had to rely on the box's contents for leads to the killer. Besides the body, it didn't contain much. Just an old blue blanket. In the crime lab, investigators tried to identify the victim. But all they had was the torso. And beneath it, the victim's right arm. Police had to depend on partial remains to tell the full story. They determined the victim was a woman in her early 20s. The autopsy revealed she was pregnant. Investigators tried to match her fingerprints, but they weren't on file. Sergeant Peters hoped to have better luck with the missing persons reports. Only the night before, police had received a call from a man named Oscar Reyes. He said his wife, Cecilia, hadn't come home from her job at a liquor store. Police found Reyes and his wife's co-worker making missing persons flyers to post in the neighborhood. Oscar Reyes was able to identify his wife's torso from a surgical scar on her neck. His wife had been found, but her killer was still at large.
Monday morning of last week.
What's the make and model on it, do you know?
Investigators had to consider the possibility that Oscar Reyes had murdered his wife. Detectives interviewed him and checked his home for signs of foul play. If Cecilia Reyes had been murdered here, they would have found a large quantity of blood. None was detected. With Oscar Reyes off the suspects list, the investigators had to find other leads.
Hey, how you doing?
They went to the store where Cecilia worked.
Ask you a few questions.
Her manager said that she was last seen the night before as she headed home. Her co-workers described her as a cheerful, open-hearted woman with no known enemies. But she did have an unwanted admirer. A man named Gerardo Marquez occasionally hung around the store. They said he enjoyed flirting with the women, especially Cecilia. He often brought her presents, though she asked him not to. He seemed strange, but harmless enough.
Right here, my bad.
Police paid a visit to Gerardo Marquez, who lived a few miles from the liquor store. He was a 36-year-old part-time fence builder who had a girlfriend. He was distressed to learn of the death of Cecilia Reyes. He hardly seemed like the kind of monster capable of killing and dismembering someone. He didn't hesitate to allow police to search his apartment. When asked about the scratches on his face, Marquez told police he'd cut himself while climbing a fence. His explanations seemed entirely plausible. His manner was completely disarming. Then, traces of blood were found in his bathroom sink. Marquez said he cut himself. Detectives reasoned that if a body had been dismembered here, much more blood would have been spilled. The killer's identity and the original crime scene remained a mystery. At the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, technicians looked for clues they hoped would lead to other suspects. They traced the box to a manufacturer in the same neighborhood as Marquez, but there the trail grew cold. Attention focused on the blanket that had been the victim's shroud. Though free of blood, it might conceal other clues. Hair, fibers, and other easy-to-miss trace evidence are often more revealing than a conspicuous bloodstain. Criminalist Raiden Hillman examined it.
There were several areas that looked like stains, but they were in a particular pattern that indicated that maybe a piece of furniture had been sat down on top of the blanket and refinished or painted on top of it.
She measured the pattern of the dark stains. The legs of the furniture that had rested on the blanket formed a rectangle 14 inches wide by 25 inches long. While taking the measurement, she also noted minute feathers lodged in the weave of the blanket. She sent them for analysis.
And you
In a
have
case
no
with
idea
few
what
leads,
that you're
detectives made the most of what they had. They asked Marquez's girlfriend to come to the police station for more questioning. She mentioned that Marquez did own a blue blanket stained with paint.
It was under the dresser.
She hadn't seen it recently. The blanket seemed to link Marquez to the crime, but detectives had to be sure it was the same blanket the girlfriend had spoken of. The distance between the paint spots would provide the answer.
So armed with these measurements, Sergeant Stevens, Shirley, and myself went out to Marquez's house and measured the post legs on the base of the bureau, and they exactly measured the markings on the blanket.
The dark stains on the blanket matched the dimensions of Marquez's bureau. Next, Hillman had to be certain that the stains came from the bureau. Following the trail of trace evidence, she reasoned that if the bureau left its mark on the blanket, then the blanket must have left its traces on the bureau.
There would be fibers from the blanket stuck on the bottom of the furniture and at least tie the blanket back to the place where the murder had occurred.
Hillman's theory about the fibers was soon proved true. Investigators found tiny blue filaments stuck to the tips of the dresser legs. With the fibers and the bureau legs, investigators began to build a case against Gerardo Marquez. To make the link between the victim and Marquez's apartment ironclad, Hillman used an infrared spectrometer to compare the paint on the blanket with the paint on the bureau.
All right, we're going to try to match up to some paint that was found in the apartment.
spectrometer shines infrared light on the sample, which absorbs and reflects it in certain ways, producing a spectrum. The apparatus then measures how the sample absorbs the light and displays the measurements as a series of peaks and valleys. Every substance has its own unique spectroscopic fingerprint.
In looking at the total spectrum, we can see what type of paint it is, and also we would compare the known sample, as this is, to any unknown samples.
The spectra from the paint on the bureau, from the paint on the blanket, lined up. The paint matched.
So you already measured this?
Hillman and Sergeant Peters compared the fibers on the dresser leg with the fabric of the blanket. Once again, the two samples had come from the same source, Marquez's apartment.
He had some questions to answer about why this blanket that was obviously affiliated with the victim was now affiliated with his apartment also.
Based on the information from the lab, detectives now believed they had found their man. They returned to Marquez's home. He remained cooperative and made it clear that he was eager for police to solve the case. He admitted that the blanket was his, but after using it as a drop cloth, he said he tossed it into a dumpster. The real killer must have retrieved it to wrap the body. The explanation was convenient and irrefutable. But investigators still had work to do. They re-examined his bathroom using leucomalachite, a chemical that makes traces of blood glow. It illuminated blood on the shower curtain. These stains could not have been the result of a minor cut. But again, Marquez had an easy explanation. He disclosed that he slaughtered his own chickens in the bathtub.
That's where I keep the chickens. Yeah, you don't know.
The freezer contained the proof and the likely source of the feathers Hillman found on the blanket. While they were in the kitchen, Marquez offered investigators some refreshments. Gerardo Marquez was acting like a man who was either completely innocent or totally cold-blooded. As police searched for the killer of Cecilia Reyes, they pinned their hopes on the blood evidence recovered from the apartment of Gerardo Marquez. Marquez had told police that the blood found on his shower curtain was chicken blood. The lab would determine if Marquez was telling the truth. swabs of the blood were tested with human anti-serum. It reacted, proving the blood on the shower curtain was shed by a human, not a chicken. But investigators didn't find enough blood to do a complete battery of tests, and not enough to indicate that a murder took place here. However, there was enough blood and enough questions to warrant another visit to Marquez. Technicians arrived to pull up the floor tiles in his bathroom. The room had been thoroughly scrubbed, but the evidence remained just below the surface.
All right, this is marked. It was obvious that there had been, at one point, quite a bit. There was enough that had soaked down underneath the floor tiles.
Tests on the sample revealed it was type O. Both Marquez and his girlfriend had given blood samples, and neither had that type. But Cecilia Reyes did. She had been here. She had died here. Based on the forensic evidence, Gerardo Marquez was arrested and charged with the murder of Cecilia Reyes. When presented with the evidence amassed against him, he said that while his girlfriend was out, Reyes had voluntarily come to his apartment. They argued, and she fell, struck her head, and died. In a panic, he had disposed of the body, fearing no one would believe his story. Investigators told Marquez that in order to believe him, they needed to examine the rest of the body to confirm the cause of death.
Where is it, right here?
Cooperative as ever, Marquez led police to a field on the outskirts of Houston.
Do this. Yeah, right.
There, abandoned in 2 more corrugated boxes, was the balance of the victim's remains.
All right, why don't you go ahead and radio this?
7825, code 6, 105 North Avenue, 52.
An autopsy revealed a bruise on the victim's head, supporting Marquez's story. Then, medical examiners found a deep knife wound in her throat. The stab wound was above the area where the victim had been dismembered and appeared to have been made by a different type of blade. That suggested the wound had been inflicted prior to the victim's death, and not during the gruesome dismemberment. Once again, the suspect was caught in a lie. Police pieced together what had probably happened on the victim's last night alive. Leaving work as usual, Cecilia Reyes was accosted by Marquez.
Hi.
He abducted her and brought her to his apartment. There, she rebuffed his sexual advances, inflicting the scratches detectives had seen on his face. During the struggle, he stabbed her to death. To expunge evidence that the victim had ever been at his home, Marquez dismembered her remains. Then he placed the body inside 3 cardboard boxes. In the dead of night, he abandoned the boxes miles from his apartment. Though the suspect's guilt was ultimately written in blood, an ordinary blanket propelled the investigation. Gerardo Marquez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Often, the most grisly murders are solved with the most mundane clues. The trick is knowing where to look and how to use them. Most homicide cases start with a body. This one began with a chance observation: a torn shirt half hidden in the grass, and a dark stain in the road that might be blood. When Officer Kenny Corcoran noticed them soon after breakfast one Sunday outside his house on Smiling Acres Road in Tangipahoa Parish, Louisiana, he knew just what to do. Call Detective Chester Pritchett.
It's all right. Tell you what I got, Chester. I got blood in the road here. You see the mark of the car.
As soon as he arrived, Pritchett wanted to see what Corcoran had found. There was a stain in the road, Corcoran explained, most likely blood from a deer or a dog hit by a passing car. The torn shirt was a little harder to explain. Both men agreed they should dig into this a little deeper.
Well, I want to do it. I will. You hear something, let me know, right?
Pritchett was known as a careful police officer. Before leaving home that Sunday morning, he had checked to see whether any accidents or missing persons had been reported. None had. Only on Tuesday did he learn of a young woman's disappearance. On the wall of the courthouse, Pritchett found a poster of a missing girl. Rebecca Forbes, a 19-year-old high school student who vanished a mere 48 hours earlier. She was wearing a white shirt, which seemed to match the one he found on Sunday.
I'm going to have to go talk to the family, get a better picture, get an idea what she was wearing.
For Pritchett, her disappearance and the discovery of the torn shirt were sufficient grounds to begin an investigation. 6:30 p.m., Saturday, April 28, 1990. At her home in Dedham, Louisiana, Rebecca Forbes prepared for a night out at the Italian Festival in nearby Independence.
Bye, Mom.
It was the last time Virginia Forbes would see her daughter alive. At the festival, Rebecca met a young man. They talked and danced and were still together when Rebecca's friends lost track of her. None of them remembered hearing his name, but with the help of police records, Pritchett hoped they still might identify him. From police files, one of Rebecca Forbes' friends picked out the man's face. His name was Kelly Trott. Just 20 years old, he was well known as a troublemaker. He had been arrested more than once for house break-ins. In time, Pritchett would interview Trott to check his version of events at the festival. Before that, he hoped to have a report on the shirt Kenny Corcoran had found. At Louisiana State Crime Laboratory, Pritchett had given the shirt to forensic scientists George Skiro and Pat Lane. He asked them to learn all they could from it. Skiro's examination began with the physical state of the shirt. He scrutinized it for what is called trace evidence: hair, fibers, material of any kind adhering to it. Next, the most basic question: were the dark stains really blood? To determine that, Skiro conducted a cascade of chemical tests, designed successively to confirm or eliminate the presence of blood. First, a cotton swab was moistened with distilled water. Blood dissolves in water, turning the tip of the swab brown. Then, a reagent called phenolphthalein was added. Now, if blood was present, the brown stain would turn green. Next, a drop of hydrogen peroxide. Blood products produce an intense pink color. Finally, Skiro carried out a test to confirm his diagnosis.
Okay.
Adding another chemical, he looked for red crystals of hemochromogen, a chemical complex formed only in the presence of blood.
And this is the final step in proving that substance is blood. It's not species specific, this particular test. It just tells us that blood is present.
For Skiro, this was just the beginning. He would schedule further, more elaborate tests. Was it human blood he had found, or that of some animal? And if it was human, whose was it? Getting answers would grow more urgent as the investigation progressed. Meanwhile, Pritchett returned to Smiling Acres Road, which he had declared a crime scene. Inch by inch, his men scoured the ground, collecting anything, however insignificant, that could be a clue.
We recovered cigarette butts, There's a possibility of saliva off the cigarette butts, maybe assistance. We've got a couple beer cans and a bottle that could yield the same thing.
And there was this, a tiny piece of clear plastic.
I'm going to submit that, all these other items to the crime lab, just see if they can do something with them.
So we may get a good
Was the fragment of plastic just roadside litter, or was it a clue? Several more weeks would pass before its true significance emerged.
I think we got some good information.
On Friday, May 4th, 6 days after Rebecca Forbes' disappearance, Detective Chester Pritchett finally caught up with suspect Kelly Trott. Did he simply have a brief encounter with Rebecca? Or did he know more than he was prepared to say? Trott admitted to meeting Rebecca. She bummed a cigarette from him. They danced. At around 10 o'clock, she disappeared into the crowd, and that was the last Trott saw of her, he said. Casual charmer or not, Kelly Trott's story began crumbling as soon as investigators examined his car.
In the trunk, there was no mat, no floor covering, and it had been pulled out, and there was water in the wheel well, which indicated to us he attempted to wash the car out. And on the hinges and under the tail light, we found splatters of what appears to be blood, tiny specks, a lot of them. And he says that it's deer blood, where he ran over a deer, put the deer in the trunk, and it was thrashing around. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Pritchett immediately ordered the suspect's car impounded. It too would be scrutinized by George Skiro and Pat Lane at the crime lab.
I'll look in the outer way places where, for instance, if someone tried to clean up blood, where would this blood go? Would it seep down behind the seat cushions? Would it go into the threads of the fabric? I'll look in all those areas. I'll look in the out-of-the-way areas.
As the search continued, Skiro began noticing blood in places inconsistent with someone having hit a deer. Blood marred the inside of the door jambs and the light switch. Now the pressure was on. Skiro had to determine the source of the blood, from the blood-stained shirt and in Kelly Trott's car.
Okay, once we determined that there was human blood on the blouse and human blood in the trunk, the next step was to do an ABO blood type and try and determine what type blood it was. When we did the examination, we found out that both samples from the blouse and in the trunk of the car were type O blood.
The test was less conclusive than Skiro had hoped. Type O blood is the most common human blood group. Here, as it turned out, both the possible victim and the possible suspect possessed it.
So it did not provide any information of value. The next step was to send it off for DNA analysis to see if a more specific genetic profile could be built up on the bloods.
It would require several weeks for the DNA tests to be completed. Before that, the case would take a dramatic new turn. Sunday, May 19th, 3 weeks after Rebecca Forbes was last seen, two men hunting along the Tangipahoa River stumbled across a badly decomposed corpse.
Well, the way this case started was with a mystery. We had some bloody clothes found in the middle of the road. Next thing we know, we got a vehicle that has blood in it, allegedly deer blood, but we proved otherwise that it was human blood. And the final thing we needed to bring this case together was to find a body that we could link to all these different scenes.
Critical to connecting the elements of the Rebecca Forbes case was GeneScreen, one of the most sophisticated testing laboratories in the United States. The State Crime Lab had identified both Rebecca's and Kelly Trott's blood type. GeneScreen was charged with refining those analyses. In our cells, we each possess our own unique individual form of DNA. GeneScreen's expertise is in testing bodily tissue to reveal its DNA fingerprint. Blood from Kelly Trott's truck and from the blood-stained woman's shirt had already been sent to the lab. The lab also received material from Rebecca Forbes' badly decomposed body. GeneScreen director Bob Giles.
DNA is a very useful forensic tool. It's very useful because it's highly discriminatory at identifying individuals. In this particular case, it was very important because this is a case involving circumstantial evidence. And without the DNA testing, the investigators were not able to link the victim's blood to the suspect's car.
When the test results were in, they could not have been clearer, as gene screen scientist Judy Floyd explains.
What the DNA did tell us, in effect, was that the blood on the blouse was that of Rebecca Forbes, and we can say that with a high degree of certainty. The blood in the back of the car of Mr. Trott was also that, most likely, of Rebecca Forbes, the victim. What the DNA did not tell us was what actually took place that night, the chain of events that led to that tragic attack.
One final piece of evidence cemented the case against Kelly Trott. That odd-shaped piece of plastic found near the bloody shirt on Smiling Acres Road. It was a fragment of crystal from a watch. Rebecca Forbes had been wearing a wristwatch when her body was found at the river. The broken crystal certainly looked as if it came from Rebecca's watch. It fit snugly onto its face. But Lane needed more evidence to prove that the two parts belonged together. Along the edge of the crystal, he noticed a series of pits, places where tiny pieces had been left behind when the crystal had been smashed. Lane made a cast of the underside of the rim to prove that the patterns on the rim and the crystal matched.
Okay, the piece that we're looking at right now is going to be the Microcell Cast that was done of the watch face, more specifically the rim area where the glass crystal would actually have been glued into or onto the face of the watch.
Now Lane could make a detailed comparison between the nicks along the edge of the crystal and the tiny fragments of plastic still trapped under the watch rim.
That piece of crystal fit in with the little imperfection breaks that had stuck in the track along the margin of that, and really turned out to be a very beautiful fracture match of that crystal.
With the final piece of evidence in place, the investigators were able to reconstruct what took place the night of the Italian festival. Rebecca had met Kelly and danced with him. Around midnight, he took her for a ride in his car. They stopped along Smiling Acres Road, where they argued. In a violent rage, Kelly Trott killed Rebecca Forbes.
The victim is dead, obviously, in this case. She can't talk. The suspect, even though he is talking, we don't know if he's being truthful or not. The physical evidence will not lie. It has the capability of telling us at a moment in time that a certain event took place. It may not necessarily tell us a whole sequence of events, but it allows us to at least pinpoint at one particular moment in time this event took place. That can then be weighed against the statements that have been made by suspect.
On May 23rd, just 4 days after the discovery of Rebecca's remains, Kelly Trott was arrested. Convicted of manslaughter, he was sentenced to 21 years in prison.
Well, Kelly worked on a construction crew at a local chicken processing plant, and he had a disagreement with one of his fellow employees that rides to work with him. He told the guy several days ago that if he didn't watch his mouth, he'd find himself in the river, just like that girl he had dumped in the river.
Evidence that can be seen by the naked eye is vital to solving a murder. But forensic science, coupled with rigorous investigative techniques, brings the smallest clues to light and brings more killers to justice.